Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's Videogram on Real Men Do Not Cry and Other Grief Myths. And in this video, we're going to look at the nature of grief found within the human male and see why society and various archetypes have evolved that have affected the way men can grieve in public and so forth. We're also going to look a little bit at some other common grief myths that are out there that you might have heard about and to correct them once and for all so that as you come across individuals who are grieving, you can know what to dismiss and so forth. So as I stated, we're looking at the fact that real men do cry, actually. That image, that male image, that archetype that we all see in the movies and in social media and so forth, that shows men as a John Wayne type figure who's emotionless when it comes to having their heart broken or having something bad happen, that they don't cry. They keep it in and so forth. And a lot of that evolved primarily due to the idea that men evolutionary are protectors. They're larger, stronger, and they protect females and women. So being considered a protector and then having this whole image of having to act omerta, to act strong and powerful and unaffected is just an idea that has just transpired throughout history. Like I said, with the idea of John Wayne or Rhett Butler at the end of Gone with the Wind, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. His famous statement, just walking away instead of showing any emotion to losing the love of his life. Or even if we look at Ian Fleming's 007, James Bond, the prototypical male never cries, never shows emotion and so forth. He's cold. These types of images have affected how men think they should grieve in public. And many men, because of that, hide their grief. And they learn this behavior even from their fathers or grandfathers before them, in that you're not supposed to cry. You're supposed to show strength for the family. You're supposed to show that external omerta behavior where you are powerful and strong, and an example of that being a pillar for the family. And that pushes away the idea that it's okay to cry, that it's okay to let emotion out. And that's very unhealthy. And that's why we have the male grief myth, the idea that men don't cry, that women are more emotional or more external than men. True, psychologically, men tend to internalize things more. That doesn't mean that they cannot express themselves with emotion. Men emotionally need to grieve just like anyone else, any other gender. It is not just exclusive to women to be able to cry and let their emotions out. It's a human emotion, the ability to show sadness, the ability to respond to grief. So men need to emotionally grieve, they need to express the loss. And the archetypes of silently grieving, these types of ideas cause later implications in the grief process, where many issues of grief and loss become unresolved and so forth. So a lot of these outdated images of masculinity, they can cause great emotional damage to men. And that's where we see a lot of what we call toxic positivity in grieving. And What's Your Grief? It's a wonderful site on grief, and they have a great blog, and they talk a lot about a lot of interesting grief subjects, and toxic positivity was one that I had read a while back. And I found it very interesting how men, especially, they try to show that false positivity, maybe to hide their grief. So anyone, you don't need to be positive. You need to experience all emotions. Being positive just to be positive in a bad situation isn't always a good thing. So there's not always, as I have written on the board, silver line is not always a silver lining. There's not always going to be one. And that is completely 100% okay. It's okay not to have to feel positive in something. A lot of other times we see individuals try to enforce their views. They're called grief bullies, so to speak, and they try to enforce their views of positivity on another, that your grieving period is over. It is time now to be positive. It's time to have a better outlook on life. And if you're not ready to, well, then there's something wrong with you. They make you feel that way and so forth. So finding positivity merely for the purpose of moving on is a negative thing and something we want to avoid. Now, on the flip side, ignoring positivity purposely can be a problem as well. Many individuals, they might feel guilty if they finally have a fleeting moment of happiness. They feel that they have debt to the individual who might have passed away, and they feel that I cannot be happy. I can't smile right now yet. It's too soon. It's wrong for me to be happy. I still should feel sad. I feel guilty because I'm having some type of happiness, because I'm beginning to adjust to the grief itself. So positivity in either light can be bad if it's just pushed or if it's completely ignored. And again, it falls under that whole shell of masculinity where I have to be positive. I have to be a pillar because I am the man. I am the one that is supposed to keep the family together. And these outdated archetypes definitely cause problems. Another grief myth of interest, and I also happen to saw on the same site, What's Your Grief? Grief becomes smaller in time. And this was looked at in depth by Dr. Louise Tonkin, and they looked at a different model. Your grief doesn't become smaller itself, but instead, over time, the bubble around that loss, that particular grief, becomes bigger. So in relationship, it appears to be smaller. So our lives can either be devoured completely by that grief and that immense loss just remains, or we can begin to grow around that grief and the growth that is around it. As our life continues, we begin to we begin to become more open and adaptable to life itself around us. And so the grief seems to be less painful. It seems to be smaller. But in this model by Tonkin, what it shows instead is that the grief has always been the same. We've just begun to emotionally adapt to that loss and to add future chapters to our life and so forth. Other grief myths include closure. You've seen a lot of individuals that say, well, you have to come to a certain time period and you have to find closure. You will eventually find closure, that they emphasize. You'll get over it and so forth. So closure is the end all to these individuals, and they think if you don't find closure, well, then you're in a pathological state. Well, in reality, anyone who finds closure after loss is lying to you, or they're fooling and deceiving themselves, because we never recover from grief. And that's one thing that needs to be really emphasized in this video. We never truly recover from grief because love prevents it. Love is so powerful, and that loss is such a stinging reminder of the loss of that love that it can never be extinguished. That love is so powerful and forever that when the beloved is absent, there's always going to be some type of pain. There's never going to be closure to that. You learn to live with it, but you never find a point where, okay, I'm over this now. It just doesn't happen that way. What we do instead is we adjust, adapt, and begin to live with the pain, because grief is forever. And that's the purpose of grief counselors. Grief counselors are not out there to heal the wound. It's there to teach us how to live with the wound itself. There are a few other grief myths on our screen that I like to go over. Grief is ordered. We've heard that one. And that one is perpetrated more because of the school of Kubler-Ross. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross really wasn't teaching that grief is in 5 stages. She was just observing how individuals with terminal illness on average respond to certain situations, and she saw a certain regular pattern. It didn't mean that each step had to be that ordered. It didn't mean that you couldn't reverse back. It didn't mean that you didn't oscillate. It didn't mean you got stuck in one and then took longer to get to the other within a certain period of time. So grief is far from ordered. Grief is chaos in many ways, and certain individuals take a lot longer. Similar to the myth of that there is closure, there's also the myth that time heals all wounds. And that's a real famous saying. But really what it means is that over time, we learn to live with the wound. It never really heals it. It never really goes away. There's always the scar. There's always the reminder itself. So you can be away from event that happened 10 years ago, then 25 years. But if you revisit that event, although you've learned to adjust, but if you visualize and put yourself back in the moment of that event, you'll see that that wound will bleed still. So time really doesn't heal all wounds, but it does teach us how to live with the loss itself. Here's another grief myth. If you do not cry, then you are not grieving. And many individuals at funerals, they might try to be judging other individuals to see how sad they are. Like, you should be really a lot more sad that you lost this particular individual. They'll be thinking to themselves, like, why isn't she sad? She's not crying. She's not exhibiting. Well, grief can be exhibited in many ways. Some people are numb. They're shell shocked, so to speak, to the grief, and they're not able to maybe cry, or maybe they cried elsewhere. But tears are not necessarily a measure of grief. They're usually a symptom, but for an individual to make a conclusion, a judgment that if you did not cry, you're not truly grieving, well, that's a misconception as well that we want to dismiss in this video. Other grief myths: the first year is the worst. Well, that's because, most consider the first year to be the most fresh element of the wound. But what we've seen is, well, yeah, you learn to adjust and so forth. But what about the anniversary? Any anniversary. I know individuals who have lost loved ones, and that each death anniversary is just as painful. Each holiday is just as painful to them. Every reminder that takes them back to that particular moment is just as painful. The only difference is they've adjusted and so forth, and the oscillations are not as intense. But the loss itself is always going to be there. Here is another grief myth that needs to really be eradicated. Children should not attend funerals. And this is a very old school concept. And I've seen it in my family as I grew up as well, where the child wasn't allowed to express his or her grief at a funeral for a lost grandparent, or God forbid, a lost parent. And instead they were forced to stay home to protect the children. And that's what we tend to see a lot, protecting children from the reality of loss because the world is too cruel and so forth. That could be with a loss of a pet, loss of a simple fish even, where a goldfish is replaced in the middle of the night. These are all things that are bad for children because it doesn't allow them to learn how to grieve, to learn how to adjust to loss. And not being allowed to attend a funeral is very detrimental to their development. Another grief myth below is spiritual people always cope better. And I put the term always there because it's not always the case. Yes, some studies have shown that individuals who have a spiritual connection sometimes cope better, but not necessarily. It's usually what we refer to as an anchor, what type of philosophy you have to help anchor you with the loss itself, to hold on to some sort of worldview. However, many spiritual people do not grieve well at all. They break down just like anyone else. Maybe their anchor is not as strong as they thought, or they develop bad spiritual habits where they begin to question their faith altogether. They blame God. They're very angry at God. That's one of the reasons why when you're dealing with someone who's lost someone, we don't usually bring up, well, it was God's will or they're in a better place, because they can very vehemently lash out against God or whoever deity that they express worship for. So not necessarily, if someone is spiritual, they're going to cope better. They might cope very, very good, or they may not cope at all. So just by saying that, although we tend to see those who have some type of worldview anchor do a little bit better, we can't 100% say if you're spiritual, you're going to cope better every time. A few other myths: grieving is unhealthy. And that goes back to the pathology of grief that we saw with Sigmund Freud. The idea of losing someone puts you in an imbalance. The key is to regain that equilibrium. And while regaining that, you're in an unnatural state. Grieving is a very natural state. Matter of fact, it is extremely important, the expression of grief, the expression of our sadness and our tears, because evolutionary speaking, it allows individuals around us, our social structure, to see that we need help, to see that we're not well. And grieving not only does that, but it also allows ourselves to mentally sort out the particular loss in a internal healthy way, to the point where we finally begin to figure out, well, I'm sad, but this is how I'm going to move on. The energy and the tears that are poured forth all are beneficial and are natural and very, very healthy. A grief response that isn't present would be far worse, would be unhealthy itself. So it really should be the opposite. Not grieving is unhealthy in whatever form you grieve in, but grieving is definitely essential. It's very important. Another one we get with a lot of grief bullies is that there are right ways to grieve, and usually it's their way. And for some, after a week, I'm done grieving. Everyone else has to get back to life. No one can remind me of what I'm secretly not able to handle, but because I have a right way to grieve, I lay it out, and everyone else must conform to it. And we all well know that that's not true. We know that grief is a very unique experience, a very subjective experience. So there really are no right ways to grieve. It's what's best for you. It's what helps you learn to adjust to the particular loss and so forth. So don't allow anyone to tell you, well, you should be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that. Grieving is a unique process to yourself. Grief counseling is for the weak, and that's another myth. And again, it goes back to that men do not cry grief motif type situation, where if you seek help, you're weak, you can't handle it on your own. What's wrong with you? And some people, they do externalize their grief. They like to talk about it. It helps them. Others internalize it better, within a healthy median, of course, because too much could be bad. But the fact that you see yourself grieving and hurting, going to someone to help understand grief, the process of grief, some steps to maybe get back into the public sphere again so that you can feel good to do things socially again. Grief counseling can help you do that. A grief counselor can help move you forward and give you the tools you need to feel better. They're not going to wave a magic wand or anything, but they are going to help. And it's definitely not a sign of weakness to go to. And if you start to develop more pathological symptoms, well, then going to a licensed professional counselor, which is beyond a grief counselor, is very important. Now, some licensed professional counselors can also be certified in grief, but when you start dealing with pathology beyond the healthy mourning, but into something that is dangerous, something that is not mentally well, well, then licensed professional counselors are important. And that's definitely not a sign of weakness either. But yet we have in society these images where you are weak if you show emotion, or you are weak if you look for help. So those are a few grief myths. You can find many online. You can just Google it if you would like. I pointed out a few of the big ones that I consider to be a problem with grief counseling and helping individuals through grief itself. And I think if we start to dismiss these and eradicate these myths, then people can begin to grieve more healthy, and society can get a better view of what true grieving is and so forth. Ultimately, as it says, grieving is unique, but Ironically, it's also universal. So everyone's going to grieve. Every human being born suffers in some way or manner. Various spiritual religions find ways to deal with that. Great. Various worldviews look for a way to deal with it. Great. But everyone is going to grieve. It is a natural human reaction to loss. It's unique, but it's universal. It's subjective, but it's also objective. So there is a basic median of what we can look at of what is over here versus over here. And everyone falls kind of in between those standards. And that's where it's objective and universal. But it's also unique and subjective in that losses differ and that individuals experience those losses differently and they have different coping mechanisms. So grief is very subjective, but objective as well. It's very unique, but universal as well. True recovery, though, what we sometimes hear of recovering from grief, there truly is no recovery from grief, but adjustment. And adjustment comes through time. It goes through going through the grieving process itself. And during that grieving process, no one can dictate how you grieve or try to make you feel less in how you grieve or make you feel less in what you are grieving over. That's not their right. It's not their place. It's your grief. So as you see here, we have a path. Grief is your own path of loss that you must travel. And at some point in life, you're going to travel that eerie looking path. But as you walk through, you're going to learn things about yourself. And you're going to see that grief, as in other videos we have, is transformative. And by the time we get to the end of the other path, we're not going to leave what we were, but we're going to find new things about ourselves. I'd like to thank you for listening today. We are the American Academy of Grief Counseling. Below is a link to our courses that you can take. There are 4 core courses that are required for qualified individuals to become certified. The certification is a 4-year certification itself. Our phone number there is 330-652-7776. Again, that number is 330-652-7776. And our email is info@aihcp.org. Again, that's info@aihcp.org. In the meantime, if you're on a grief journey right now, don't be fooled by various grief myths. Take grief and your loss and make it your own, and don't allow others to bully you into doing things that you're not ready to do yet. Thanks for listening and have a good day.